Herzlich willkommen zum Jean Monnet Podcast der Martin-Luther-Universität Halle-Wittenberg. Welcome to the Jean Monnet Podcast of the University Halle.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I see that most of you have also attended my first two lectures. I trust they've been worthwhile for you. I will be changing the subject today. Earlier this week, in the first two lectures, I've drawn in my remarks from books I've written previously, essays I've written. Today, I will be drawing from my forthcoming new book, Democracy for a Sustainable World, The Path from the Pnyx, which will be published in May by Cambridge University Press. As mentioned, it's not about trade. This new book is about the relationship I see between democracy and sustainable development. And it's about how I believe we can make the phrase democratic global governance something other than what it is now, which is an oxymoron. Indeed, I believe we can achieve democratic global governance at every level of governance. I said both yesterday and the day before that I believe we have a duty of optimism in setting out for you the agenda that I believe the WTO should and could be pursuing now. In my lecture yesterday, I believe I demonstrated that I am an optimist. Today, my optimism will be on full display in the proposals that I am making in my new book. If we look around us, then we, at first glance, don't see reason for optimism. We see reason aplenty for pessimism. Recently, the negotiators on biodiversity at their conference of parties in Colombia made some progress, but they were unable to do what most needs to be done, which is provide abundant financing to preserve nature, protect nature and us from further biodiversity loss. As I speak today, climate negotiators are assembling in Bacchus. What are we likely to get there? Yesterday, the chairman of the conference, the host, suggested that we need to double down on oil and gas production. This is not quite what you would expect of someone hosting a climate conference, which is devoted above all to trying to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. The Security Council of the United Nations has failed in its efforts thus far to end conflict in Ukraine following the Russian aggression there. I could go on. There is evidence aplenty that would seem to give us cause for not being too optimistic. Add to this what seems to be a global retreat from democracy and the liberalism that is required to make democracy work as it should. If one looks at the annual Freedom House reports or other assessments of where we stand on democracy worldwide, and one sees that most of the people in the world do not live in democracies. Nearly half live in authoritarian regimes. Among those people who supposedly live in democracies, many of them live in countries that are democratic in name only. And for the most part, in representative democracies, we see what political theorists describe as thin democracy. A thin democracy is one in which democracy consists mainly of voting every now and then, and perhaps maybe showing up for jury duty. The United States of America, I'm proud to say, is still a democracy, but in my view, it is a thin democracy. What is the relationship between democracy and sustainable development? Sustainable development being a goal that every member of the United Nations has embraced in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including the United States of America. Here, let me read an excerpt from the introduction to my new book. It is through the human development that results from sustainable development that we as individuals can become more capable of governing ourselves in a democracy, and thus of making democracy work. And it is through the institution and the practice of democracy that we as humanity can find the will and the way to pursue and accomplish the societal transformations needed to achieve sustainable development. Free and open societies in which all citizens have an equal opportunity to participate, support the creativity and innovation that are needed for problem solving in a world too full of the problems posed by the multiplicity of obstacles to sustainable development. And freedom and openness feed the optimism that is indispensable to summoning the will to solve these problems and overcome these obstacles. This, as I see it, is the relationship between democracy and sustainable development. Thus, in my view, democracy is not possible without sustainable development, and sustainable development is not possible without democracy. In addition to our failures of international cooperation, at a time when international cooperation is urgently needed and needed more than ever before, we are seeing the basis for effective governance democratically crumble in different parts of the world. We are seeing authoritarianism on the rise. Why is that? In my view, this retreat from democracy and increasingly also from liberal values in democratic countries can be traced mostly to increasing hopelessness about the future, even a fear about the future, an apprehension about what comes next. We live more than ever in a time of uncertainty, and increasingly individuals find that they feel that they are on their own. Furthermore, they don't trust those that once, in many places, where democracy succeeded, they trusted before. There is a pervasive failure of trust in the democratic countries of the world. Indeed, there's less and less trust of governance in countries that are not democratic. I can assure you from my visits there that the people of China trust their one-party government less than they did a generation ago. This is part of the explanation for recent events in my own country, and I think the United States is only one of the many places in the world where we see this lack of trust. As a consequence, people don't know where to turn. They no longer trust the so-called elites. They don't trust their elected officials. They don't trust the scientists. They don't trust the experts of all kinds. They don't trust institutions. Least of all do they trust international institutions, which of course have a democratic deficit. Institutions internationally have a legitimacy that comes only from their member states that have formed them. And when so many of those member states are not democratic, and indeed are authoritarian in some fashion, then how legitimate is that? How do we remedy this? How do we restore trust where it once existed? How do we make it where it has never been? To me, the remedy is participation. I believe what's missing in governance, what's missing in what we call democratic governance, is participation. Instead of having thin democracies, we should construct strong democracies in which participation is not simply a matter of voting every now and then, but in which democratic participation is a way of life. And to achieve this, I think we need to change the structures of democracy. Thank you, Amanda. Where do we go to find ideas about how the structures of democracy ought to be changed? I was trained as an historian, in addition to being trained in law. So I tend to look to history, and to answer this question, I look to ancient history. I look to ancient Athens. I look to the first democracy, which was established in 508 BC, when a man who surprisingly has been forgotten by history, a renegade aristocrat named Cleisthenes, linked arms with the common people of Athens and created a new form of self-rule. It was there that we see, in retrospect, the first kind of governance that we can recognize as being democracy. Let me emphasize, this was a democracy with quite a few faults. There were about 250,000 people in the Athenian city-state, which comprised an area called Attica, about the size of the American state of Rhode Island. But only a minority of them were citizens who were permitted to participate in this new kind of government called democracy. About half of them were slaves. About half of them were women. There were also many thousands of migrants. None of the slaves or the women or the migrants were permitted to be citizens. Citizens were only those men who were 18 years or older. But for them, the democracy they shared was the purest and most direct democracy the world has ever seen. Because the citizens of Athens at that time actually ruled themselves through what the political theorists describe as a direct democracy. They did not elect a president. They did not elect representatives to speak on their behalf. They spoke on their own behalf. They assembled at least 40 times a year on a hillside just across from the Acropolis in Athens called the Pnyx, hence the subtitle of my book. And 6,000 strong, first come, first serve in terms of arriving for the assembly. They made all the major decisions of the city-state by majority vote, directly. And then to administer the city-state, except in a very few instances, such as the generals who led the army and the treasurer who kept the city-state's gold and silver and other valuable metals. They chose every other administrative post by lot, by random selection, by what is called sortition. Indeed, the classicists today, looking back, have concluded that perhaps as many of a third of all the citizens of Athens at some point in their lives held a responsible administrative role in the governance of the city-state. They would serve for a year. They would only be allowed to serve twice for 1 year in their lifetimes. There were hundreds of positions. The 10-member administrative board that was in charge of roads and bridges, the 10-member administrative board that was in charge of weights and measures. All the things that we in our then democracies today create governmental departments to do were all governed through people who were chosen by random selection once a year. And what the Athenians built was, in our modern thinking, something that could be described as a system. It was a network, an interlocking network that together developed among hundreds of city-states that all shared the Greek culture. By far the one that is remembered most and that accomplished most economically, culturally and otherwise at the time. This was done through direct democracy. It was done through a fully participatory democracy. And what I believe we need today is a fully participatory democracy. I think it's only through being able to participate in their own governance, is only by true self-rule in strong and living democracies, that the people today in the world who feel like they've been left over, left out, and left behind will find hope, find confidence, and be able to find a renewed mutual trust that will enable them to make democracy work, and that will enable them to do what needs to be done to achieve sustainable development. And as I said earlier, it's in achieving the human development that comes from sustainable development that we develop the capability to make democracy work. And it's through the participatory kinds of democracy that enable us to find the right ways to do what must be done by solving problems and producing results that we can achieve sustainable development. How would I do this? In their random selection, the Athenians used an early ancient machine called a Kleroterion. If you want to look it up online, it's Kleroterion. If you happen to go to Athens and to the Agora and to the museum there, you can see one of these machines, an ancient Kleroterion. And these were the machines that they used to randomly select the Athenian citizens who participated in their jury courts, who served on their administrative boards, who made Athens and the democratic system and network of Athens work, and work successfully. The good news for us is that we don't need a Kleroterion, because unlike the ancient Athenians, we know about scientific random sampling. I'm sure you've had statistics in basic mathematics, and so you understand that scientific sampling can produce a representative sample that is reflective of the diversity of a population that is sampled. When Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, John Adams, and others among the founders of my country decided to create the United States of America, one of their great fears was that country was so large and the population was so large that they would not be able to sustain a democracy. Part of the reason that they created a representative democracy, if you read James Madison, one of the other founders, is that it was a substitute, a second best substitute for having the direct democracy that Athens had. Representative democracy was thought was necessary because of the large size of the American population. There was simply no way, in their view, that there could be direct democracy except possibly in the proverbial New England town meetings, some of which still occur. But they didn't know about scientific sampling. We know all these years later that in scientific sampling, in making certain that it is representative and reflects the diverse composition of a population, it is not the size of the population that matters. It is the size of the sample. The larger the sample, so long as it's random, the less the margin of error in terms of being representative. Thus, it's possible to have a sample of a certain size that would reflect representatively 1,000 people, but also 1 million people. And scientific sampling makes it possible for us to use sortition on a global basis, which is precisely what I propose. I believe that the best democracy, the most effective democracy, the one that can achieve sustainable development, the one that can be improved in turn by sustainable development, the one that can restore trust, is a democracy that combines the best of individual wisdom with the best of collective wisdom. I would keep representation, but I would improve it. In my own country, I would do away with the power of money to influence elections. I would do away with the distortions of electoral districts. I would do away in our presidential elections with the electoral college. I would create real representation based on the merits of those who stand for election, so that those representatives would not only heed the people, but would also have the courage truly to lead them. But I do not believe that merely having right representation is enough. I would also add to this collective wisdom. Collective wisdom comes from the use of sortition. If one looks at Condorcet's jury theorem, which he devised while he was imprisoned by Robespierre and the terrorists during the French Revolution before his tragic death. And if one looks all the way back to Aristotle in his Politics, in which he first said that the wisdom of the crowd can be greater than the wisdom of any one person in it, then one sees the potential for collective wisdom. And collective wisdom can be derived by the use of random selection. Now you may say, if we use random selection, we could get people in positions of decision-making authority who are totally unqualified to exercise that authority. But think about it. Either we believe that people are capable of governing themselves, or we do not. Either we believe in democracy, or we do not. Those who say that people are capable of electing their representatives, but they are not capable of governing themselves, are what I call half Democrats. They're only partly democratic. If one individual is not expert sufficiently to be capable of governing themselves, the answer is not to prevent people from governing themselves. The answer is to make certain that citizens are indeed capable of exercising decision-making power. In other words, don't take away democracy, instill more democracy, and make it work. My proposals are novel, but my ideas are not. My ideas build on Immanuel Kant, on the great German-American thinker Hannah Arendt, on the American philosopher John Dewey, and on two of Dewey's followers, now departed, who were both friends of mine, Benjamin Barber and Beck Anderson. They all believed in a living democracy that meant more than just voting and complaining in between votes. What would I do? First of all, I would begin working to instill structures of both right representation and sortition at every level of governance worldwide. Where there are democracies, I would add to the institutions of representation, institutions of sortition that would share equally in decision-making. Where there are not democracies or only nominal democracies, I would work to instill democracy and shape it in ways that would combine both right representation and sortition. And where there is no democracy, where there is only authoritarianism, I would fight for democracy and then try to make it work. How would I restructure these democratic institutions at every level? I would do so in much the same way, which I describe at length in the book, but I'll only outline now. The right representation I've already described. I would keep, for example, the General Assembly of the United Nations, and I would keep the Council of Delegates to the WTO. These all represent nation states, for better or worse. They're all artifacts of the ongoing Westphalian system of international law and practice that builds all international governance on the basis of nation states. I believe we need to depart from that by beginning to create institutions that do not represent nation states, but rather represent our common humanity. So, for example, with the United Nations, I would create a participatory assembly. Unlike some reformers, I would not have people elected by nation states then to become delegates in a new popular assembly in the United Nations. I would not recreate in the United Nations the European Parliament or the United States House of Representatives. Instead, I would go completely around the nation states. I would ask for volunteers from all over the world and do all I could to encourage the United Nations to seek out volunteers. The United Nations engaged in quite a successful effort in developing the Sustainable Development Goals by seeking out several million people from around the world who participated in some fashion in that effort. What we need instead are several billion. I would only have volunteers. I would give nation states absolutely no authority to engage in this process in any way. And if nation states posed obstacles to it, I would deny to them the benefits of their participation in any institution that sought to engage in this global sortition, but was prevented from doing so by that nation state. In other words, if one country decided they weren't going to agree to allow a sampling of their population, I would deny that country any privileges they currently had in being a member of the United Nations, including serving on the Security Council, which itself needs to be reformed. And I would not just do this in the United Nations, I would do it in every single international institution. In the international institution with which I'm most familiar, I will also have what I call a circle of participation, randomly chosen from throughout the world. I have suggested that these circles of participation would consist of 151 members each. Why that? If you look at your sociology and psychology and political theory, then you'll be acquainted with something called Dunbar's number. It's a British theorist named Dunbar who's concluded after some study that the ideal number of people to have in a group is about 150, because he has demonstrated empirically that that's the maximum number of people that any average person can know and work with on an ongoing basis. I would make the number 151 because that way you could have a majority vote. So in the WTO, as in other international institutions, whether it's United Nations Environment Program or whether it's UNESCO, whatever it may be, or in multilateral environmental arrangements, other international fora, I would convene these circles of participation and I would give them equal decision-making power with the current councils of delegates. In other words, it would take an affirmative decision by both the current group of representatives from their countries and also the randomly chosen circle of participation to approve an action. I'm sure this will be immediately popular in Geneva. And as I said, I would do this everywhere, in all institutions. With some of them, they might want to choose from among volunteers who've expressed an interest in their particular line of endeavor. People have expressed an interest in environmental issues, for example, might volunteer for the circle of participation for the United Nations Environment Program or the United Nations Development Program. But I would not simply have these circles of participation. I would also have two additional kinds of circles randomly chosen, again from volunteers, and in some institutions from volunteers who have a particular interest in particular areas. I would have circles for nature. In my book, I speak at length about our failure to see as a species that we are simply one among many other species who share this planet. and our failure as a species to see that ours is a part of the planet. We are not separate from nature. We're a part of it. You have only to look at the latest news on your smartphone to see the truth of what I've just said. But we're only slowly coming to that realization as a species. We are animals. We are one among many species, alas, a declining number. And all that lives on this planet depends on all the rest of nature within this fragile biosphere of ours. So I would have circles for nature that would advise these decision makers, these delegates engaged in right representation, and these circles of participation chosen by random selection on their decisions to make certain that they remember the centrality of nature. I would also have circles for the future. These also would be randomly chosen from volunteers, and I suggested that the members of these circles should be between the ages of 12 and 21. If you don't believe that teenagers have something to say about the future, then you haven't been paying attention lately. In many ways, they're far ahead of the rest of us. And I have every confidence that they are fully capable of reminding us of our need to, as we say in sustainable development, give priority to intergenerational equity. We need to look, each of us, at our self-interest in a new and different way. We need to consider our principle of interest rightly understood, as Tocqueville put it nearly 200 years ago. We need to look broadly to our interest, which would include everyone else in humanity and all of nature. And we need to look over the long term, which would include our future. Now, before I entertain questions about how we might achieve any of this, let me make a few final points. Again, this is all about trust and the lack of trust in our current circumstances. Why do I think that participation will create trust? I have had the privilege in my life, a life in which I began to engage in public actions at the age of 13, to serve in positions of significant responsibility, administratively, executively, judicial, legislatively, at every level of governance. And in my experience, people are much more inclined to trust what they have had a say in making. In addition to participation, there must be a deliberation that enables everyone who's participating to have their say. If you ask me, what is the moral justification for democracy? I would tell you it is that every human being is equal in human dignity, and therefore has an equal claim to an equal say in every decision that may affect them. I would argue also that there is an abundance of evidence, and I set it out in the book, that not only is there this moral argument for democracy, but there's an argument of practical utility for democracy. When democracy is employed, invariably the results are better than when it's not, in terms of improving lives and prosperity and overall well-being. Authoritarianism simply does not produce those results. Authoritarians may achieve what they set out to achieve, but none of them are interested in achieving the full human flourishing of their people, which is the rightful goal of democracy. We need the right leaders. We need leaders who will stand up and tell us what we need to hear and not what we just want to hear at any given time. People who will truly lead us and not appease us by appealing to our fears and apprehensions. We need the right type of interaction, of course, among these institutions once they're created. Just as the ancient Athenians had a democratic network, all these circles of participation for all these institutions at every level must be interconnected through rules and through procedures and other practices that will produce a just outcome. The last point I want to make is that if we want to create this type of living democracy, if we want to create systems of governance that will actually work to achieve the goals we set for ourselves, if we want to make democratic global governance something other than an oxymoron, then we cannot wait for someone else to do it for us. We have to begin ourselves. Lastly then, how can we think that doing something ourselves will make a difference? Well, here I mention what I see as one of the greatest sources for optimism, which is the ever-increasing number throughout the world of bottom-up, grassroots, sustainable development networks that are working to achieve all the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. Even though many of the people participating in many of these networks have never even heard of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are self-starting, generally voluntary, self-governing, volunteer groups all over the planet. I'm sure there are many within just a few miles of here. Some of them are trying to clean up poisoned water. Some of them are trying to educate disadvantaged kids. Some of them are trying to make certain that we strike as communities against air pollution, carbon emissions. They're working in 1,000 different ways. Each and every one of them is an example of a new kind of democratic participation. And the hundreds of thousands of people who are active in these types of endeavors worldwide can be the genesis of the kinds of changes that I believe we must seek. We have very little time, though. So we need to begin seeking these changes now. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to entertain your questions.
Dieser Podcast wurde finanziert von der Europäischen Union. Bis zum nächsten Mal. This podcast was financed by the European Union. Take care.